The scream that tore through Draven's chest was silent, because it came from inside a dream, but it felt more real than anything he had touched while awake. He shot upright in bed, his heart slamming against his ribs, his hand reaching across the sheets for a body that was not there. The space beside him was cold. Not cool. Not just empty for a moment, but cold, in the way that told him hours had passed since anyone had lain there. He said her name into the dark room. Celine. No answer came back. Only the soft creak of the castle settling around him, the wind pressing against the tall windows, and the distant call of a night bird somewhere over the forest. He told himself she had gone to check on the pups in the nursery wing, or perhaps she could not sleep, and had walked down to the kitchens for warm milk the way she sometimes did when her mind was restless. He told himself several comforting stories in the space of a few seconds, the way people do when they are trying to outrun fear before it catches them. Then he saw the ring. It sat on the windowsill, catching the pale light of the moon, exactly where her hand would have rested if she had leaned against the glass and looked out over the packlands one last time. Draven's whole body went still. He knew that ring. He had placed it on her finger himself, in front of the entire pack, on the night he called her his mate and his queen, before every wolf who mattered. She never took it off, not to bathe, not to run through the trees in her wolf form, not even to sleep. It was a part of her, the way her own skin was a part of her. He crossed the room in 3 strides and picked it up, and his hand trembled as he closed his fingers around the cold metal. There was no note tucked beneath it, no scrap of parchment, no explanation folded into a careful square the way she folded everything, from letters to linens. Just the ring, alone, glinting like a small accusation. He called for her again, louder this time, and his voice cracked in a way that surprised him, because Draven was not a man who cracked. He was the Alpha King. Wolves twice his age had learned to lower their eyes when he entered a room. He had led his pack through territory disputes, through harsh winters, through the kind of politics that could tear packs apart from the inside, and he had done it all without his voice ever betraying him. But now, alone in his own chamber, with an empty bed, and a ring that should have been on his mate's hand, his voice betrayed him completely. He threw open the door, and the 2 guards stationed outside straightened immediately, snapping to attention, but something in his face must have told them this was not a normal morning, because neither of them spoke first. Draven asked where the queen was. Neither guard knew. They had seen no one leave through the main hall since midnight, when the last of the kitchen staff had gone to bed. That should have been reassuring. It was the opposite. If she had not gone out through the main hall, then either she was still somewhere in the castle, or she had left in a way that no one was meant to notice. Draven moved through the halls with a speed that made the tapestries shiver in the wind of his passing. He checked the nursery first, his heart pounding with a fear he did not want to name, but the pups were asleep in their small beds, watched over by an elderly nurse who startled awake at the sound of the door and assured him nothing was wrong there. He checked the kitchens, empty, cold, the fires banked for the night. He checked the library, where Celine sometimes read until dawn when sleep would not come to her, and found only her favorite chair, empty, with a book closed on the small table beside it, a book she had been in the middle of reading only 2 days before, the ribbon marker still resting exactly where she had left it. By the time he reached the garden, word had already begun to spread through the castle. Servants who should have been beginning their morning duties were instead gathering in small, hushed clusters near the corridors, whispering to one another, falling silent whenever Draven passed. He hated that silence. He hated it more than shouting, because silence meant people already suspected something they were afraid to say out loud in front of him. The garden was where he found the first real sign, not of her leaving, exactly, but of her having stood there, thinking, for a long time before she vanished. The grass near the low stone wall at the garden's edge was pressed flat in the shape of someone standing still for hours, the kind of mark that only forms when a person does not shift their weight, does not pace, does not fidget the way most people do, even when they believe they are calm. Celine had stood in that one spot, facing the forest, for what must have been most of the night. Draven knelt and pressed his palm against the grass, as if he could still feel some warmth left behind, some trace of her that the earth had kept safe for him. There was nothing. Only cold ground and the smell of dew and, faintly, so faintly he almost convinced himself he imagined it, the scent of her, drifting toward the tree line and then disappearing, as though the wind itself had decided to erase her path. He called his second-in-command, a steady and loyal wolf named Corwin, and ordered a full search of the grounds. Corwin, to his credit, did not ask foolish questions. He gathered a team within minutes, and soon the castle grounds were alive with searchers moving through the gardens, the stables, the training yards, even the old watchtower that had not been used in years. Draven joined them himself, refusing every suggestion that he wait inside while others searched, because waiting felt like a kind of surrender he was not prepared to make. They searched until the sun was fully risen, and they found nothing, no struggle. No sign of an intruder, no broken gate or damaged wall that might explain how someone could have taken her against her will. The absence of any evidence of harm should have comforted him, and in some distant corner of his mind it did, because it meant she had not been dragged away screaming. But it also meant something else, something that sat far heavier in his chest. It meant she had walked out on her own. It meant that, for reasons he could not begin to understand, his mate had chosen to leave him in the middle of the night without a single word. He gathered the senior members of the pack in the great hall by mid-morning, and he watched their faces as he told them what had happened. Some looked shocked. A few, he noticed, did not look surprised at all, and he filed that observation away, quietly, the way a king learns to file away every small detail that might later matter. An elder named Iris, who had served 3 generations of the ruling family, asked gently whether the queen had seemed troubled in recent weeks. Draven wanted to say no, wanted to insist that everything had been well between them, that their bond was strong, that nothing in his life had felt more certain than his love for Celine. But even as the denial rose in his throat, memories pushed back against it. She had been quieter lately, not distant, not cold, but quieter, the way a person becomes when they are carrying something they have not yet decided to share. Twice in the past month, he had walked into a room and found her staring out a window with an expression he could not quite name, something between sadness and determination, and both times she had smiled when she noticed him and changed the subject before he could ask what troubled her. He had let it go, because he trusted her, because he believed that whatever weighed on her, she would tell him when she was ready. Now he wondered if he had made a mistake by not pressing harder, by respecting her silence instead of breaking through it. The rest of that day passed in a blur of search parties returning with nothing to report, of messengers sent to neighboring villages to ask whether anyone had seen the queen traveling alone, of Draven pacing the length of the great hall until his legs ached and his mind felt raw from turning the same questions over and over without finding a single answer that satisfied him. By the time evening came, exhaustion had settled into his bones so deeply that even his fear could not keep him upright any longer, and Corwin finally convinced him to rest, if only for a few hours, promising that the search would continue through the night, and that Draven would be woken the moment anything was found. He lay down in the same bed where he had woken to find her missing, and he told himself he would only close his eyes for a short while, that he would not truly sleep, that his mind was too full of worry to allow it. He was wrong. Exhaustion pulled him under almost immediately, and it was there, in the depths of that unwilling sleep, that he first heard her voice. He was standing in the garden, in the exact spot where the grass had been pressed flat, except in the dream the grass was untouched, soft and green beneath his bare feet, and the moon overhead was brighter than any moon he had ever seen while awake. Celine stood a short distance away, facing the trees, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, wearing the pale blue dress she had worn on the night of their bonding ceremony. He called her name, and she turned to him slowly, and even in the strange logic of the dream, he noticed that her eyes were wet, though no tears fell. She did not run to him. She did not explain herself. She simply looked at him with an expression that broke something loose in his chest, an expression full of love and grief, tangled together so tightly that he could not tell where one ended and the other began, and she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Forgive me, I had no choice." Draven woke with those words still echoing in his ears, so vivid that for one disoriented moment he was certain she had been in the room with him, that he had only to reach out and she would be there. He sat up, breathing hard, and scanned the darkness, but he was alone, exactly as he had been the night before. He pressed his hand against his chest, where the mate bond lived, the invisible thread that connected him to her, no matter the distance between them, and he felt it there still, faint but unbroken, like a candle flame guttering in the wind but refusing to go out entirely. That thread told him something crucial. She was alive. Whatever had happened, wherever she had gone, she was still alive, because a broken bond felt like nothing at all, an absence so total it was said to drive some wolves mad with grief. What he felt instead was distance, strain, something stretched thin, but not severed. It was the first piece of real hope he had been given since waking to that empty bed, and he held onto it the way a drowning man holds onto driftwood. He did not tell anyone about the dream at first. It seemed too strange, too fragile a thing to share with guards and elders who were already looking to him for strength and leadership in the middle of a crisis. What would they think if their king announced that he believed his missing queen had spoken to him in his sleep? They might worry for his mind as much as they worried for her safety, so he kept it to himself, turning her words over and over in the privacy of his own thoughts. "Forgive me. I had no choice." It was not the message of a woman who had simply grown tired of her marriage and walked away out of boredom or resentment. It was the message of someone who believed she was protecting him, or protecting someone else, by leaving. The next morning brought no new information from the search parties, but it brought something almost as important, a shift in Draven's own thinking. Instead of asking only where Celine had gone, he began to ask why. He returned to her chambers, the ones that had been hers alone before their marriage, and that she still used as a private study, and he began to look not for signs of a struggle, but for signs of a decision. He opened drawers he had never opened before, out of respect for her privacy, and felt a small twist of guilt, even now, even with her missing, at intruding on spaces she had always kept to herself. But guilt was a luxury he could not afford, not while she was out there somewhere, carrying a burden heavy enough to make her leave everything behind without a word. In the bottom drawer of her writing desk, beneath a stack of ordinary correspondence, he found a locked box he had never seen before. It was small, made of dark wood, with a brass clasp that resisted when he tried it. He was tempted to force it open right there, but something made him pause, some instinct telling him this needed to be handled carefully, that whatever was inside might hold answers too important to damage in his haste. He carried the box to Corwin instead, and together they found a locksmith among the pack's craftsmen who could open it without breaking the delicate mechanism. Inside were letters, a dozen of them, at least, written in a careful hand that Draven recognized instantly as Celine's, though the words themselves meant almost nothing to him at first glance. They were written in a kind of code, symbols and phrases that did not form ordinary sentences, the sort of private language that two people invent when they need to communicate secrets that must never fall into the wrong hands. He stared at those pages for a long time, his stomach twisting with a mixture of fear and something close to relief, because whatever this was, it confirmed what the dream had already told him. Celine had not simply left. She had been planning something, carefully and quietly, for longer than he had realized, and whatever it was, it had been important enough to risk everything for. He gathered every letter, every scrap of parchment from that box, and spread them across the table in his private study, determined to find some way to understand them, even if it took him the rest of the night. Corwin offered to help, and Draven accepted gratefully, because he did not think he could face this alone, not when each unreadable line felt like a piece of his mate slipping further out of reach. As they worked, comparing symbols, trying to find patterns, Draven found his mind drifting back to the dream, to the desperate sorrow in Celine's voice as she asked for forgiveness. He was beginning to understand, in the way one understands the shape of a storm long before it arrives, that whatever she had done it for him. And that meant that somewhere beyond the borders of his kingdom, his mate was carrying a danger alone that she believed only she could face. And every hour he spent decoding letters instead of riding out to find her felt like an hour stolen from her safety. Outside, the pack continued to whisper. Some said the queen had abandoned her king out of fear, unable to bear the weight of ruling beside him. Others suggested darker things, that she had never truly loved him, that the marriage had been built on obligation rather than genuine devotion. Draven heard these rumors secondhand, carried to him by loyal servants who thought he deserved to know what was being said in the corridors, and each one struck him like a blow, not because he believed them, but because he knew Celine would be devastated to learn her name was being spoken with doubt, while she was out there sacrificing herself, for reasons no one yet understood. He resolved, sitting there in the lamplight with unreadable letters scattered before him, that he would not rest until he found her, until he understood exactly what had driven her away, and until every wolf in his kingdom knew the truth of her courage rather than the poison of rumor. The bond in his chest pulsed faintly, steady as a heartbeat, and he pressed his hand against it once more, silently promising her, wherever she was, that he was already coming. The night stretched on, and though his body begged for rest, he refused to close his eyes again until he had made real progress with the letters. When sleep finally claimed him near dawn, slumped over the table with ink-stained fingers and a heart full of determination, he half expected the dream to return. It did not that night. But he woke certain of one thing, that no amount of rumor or fear could shake loose from him. Celine had not left because she stopped loving him. She had left because she loved him enough to walk into danger alone, rather than let it touch him first. And now it was his turn to prove that her sacrifice would not be wasted, that he would follow her into whatever darkness she had entered, and bring her home, whatever the cost. 2 nights after the first dream, exhaustion finally dragged Draven under again, and this time, the garden was gone. Instead, he stood in a place he did not recognize, a narrow stone room lit by a single flickering torch, the walls damp and cold in a way that made his skin prickle, even within the dream. Celine was there, seated on a low bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and though she did not look injured, there was a tension in her posture that told him she was not free to leave that room whenever she wished. She looked up when he appeared, and relief flooded her face for just a moment before something like fear replaced it. She rose and crossed the space between them quickly, though she stopped short of touching him, as if some invisible barrier kept them apart even in this shared dream. Draven asked her where she was, begged her to tell him how to find her, and she opened her mouth to answer, but the dream shuddered around them like a candle flame caught in a draft, and her voice came out fractured, only pieces of words reaching him before the darkness pulled him back to his own waking bed. He sat up gasping. The image of that damp stone room burned into his mind, and he understood with sudden clarity that these dreams were not simply memories, or grief playing tricks on him. Something in the bond between them, something ancient and rarely spoken of even among the pack elders, was allowing fragments of her reality to reach him while he slept. It was faint, unreliable, and maddeningly incomplete, but it was real, and it was the closest thing to a map he had. He spent the following days in a strange rhythm, working through Celine's coded letters by day, and by night, praying for sleep to bring him back to her, even if only for a few disjointed minutes at a time. Corwin, watching him grow thinner and more hollow-eyed with each passing day, finally asked him directly what was happening, and Draven, too exhausted to keep guarding the secret any longer, told him everything. To his relief, Corwin did not question his sanity. Instead, the older wolf's expression grew solemn, and he admitted that he had heard old stories, tales from before either of them was born, about mates whose bond ran deep enough to cross distances that should have been impossible. If Draven was seeing her, Corwin said quietly, then it meant the bond between them was stronger than most, strong enough that even danger and distance could not fully sever it. That knowledge steadied Draven in a way nothing else had since the morning he woke to an empty bed. He was not losing his mind. He was not chasing shadows built from grief and wishful thinking. Somewhere out there, in a cold stone room lit by a single torch, Celine was alive, and she was reaching for him just as desperately as he was reaching for her. All he had to do was find a way to close the distance between them, before whatever held her there could do something neither of them could undo. The letters finally began to yield their secrets on the 5th day, though not through any brilliant flash of insight. It was patience, plain and grinding, that broke the code, along with the help of an old scholar named Fenwick, who had once served as tutor to Celine when she was a girl, and who remembered a private language she had invented as a child to write in her diary without her siblings reading it. He recognized a handful of the symbols the moment Draven showed them to him, and from there, the rest unraveled like a knot finally given the right amount of slack. What the letters revealed made Draven's blood run cold in a way no rumor or whisper from the pack ever could. They were not simple diary entries or idle thoughts. They were records, careful and deliberate, of threats that had been arriving for weeks, smuggled to Celine through channels she had kept entirely hidden from her husband. Someone had been demanding something from her, someone with enough power and reach to make even the queen of a strong pack tremble, and the demand, spelled out in her careful private code, was this: return to fulfill an old promise, or watch everyone you love pay the price. Draven read that line 3 times before he could make himself accept its meaning. An old promise. He had never heard of any promise involving Celine from before their marriage, and the fact that she had never mentioned it told him it must have been something she believed was long buried, something from a part of her life before he knew her. He pressed Fenwick for anything he might remember about her family, about arrangements made when she was young, and the old scholar's face grew troubled as old memories surfaced. Fenwick explained, slowly and with visible reluctance, that Celine's family had once been allied through a betrothal agreement with the ruling house of a neighboring territory, a pack led by an alpha named Kale, known even then for his cold ambition and his willingness to use any tool at his disposal to expand his influence. The agreement had been broken years before Draven ever met Celine, when her family chose a different path for her, a choice that had apparently caused lasting resentment in Kale's household. Fenwick had assumed the matter long settled, a piece of old history with no bearing on the present. Clearly, he had been wrong. Draven sat with that information for a long time after Fenwick left the room, turning it over, trying to understand how a broken promise from Celine's youth could have grown into something powerful enough to make her vanish in the middle of the night without a single word to the man she loved. The answer, when it came to him, was simple and devastating in its clarity. Kale had not forgotten. He had waited, patiently, for the right moment to make his claim again, and he had chosen his moment carefully, when Celine had the most to lose and the least room to refuse without endangering everyone around her. The letters made clear that the threats had not been directed at Celine alone. They named names: her younger sister, still living in their family's original territory, far from the protection of Draven's pack; her elderly father, whose health had already been fragile for years; and, most chilling of all to Draven, though her earlier letters made careful effort not to write it plainly, veiled references to Draven himself, warnings that violence could reach even the strongest of kings if the queen refused to cooperate. She had not left because she stopped loving him. She had left to keep a threat from becoming real, choosing to walk directly into danger rather than risk even the smallest chance that her family, or her mate, might suffer because of a promise made before she ever had the power to refuse it herself. Draven felt something in his chest crack open at the understanding. Grief and fury tangled together so tightly he could barely breathe through it. She had carried this alone. She had decided, without ever giving him the chance to stand beside her, that this was a burden only she could bear. He wanted to be angry with her for that, and in some small corner of his heart, he was, because he had believed they faced everything together, because he had promised her on the night of their bonding that nothing would ever come between them, that they could not face as one. But the anger could not survive long against the weight of what she had actually done. She had not doubted his strength or his willingness to fight for her. She had simply loved her family and her mate enough to try to shield them from a danger she believed could reach further than any of their combined strength could stop. At least, not without cost none of them would want to pay. Corwin, when shown the translated letters, went very still, the way seasoned warriors go still when they recognize the shape of a real threat rather than a rumor. He confirmed what Fenwick had already suggested, that Kale's territory bordered their own to the east, separated by a stretch of contested forest that had caused tension between the two packs for as long as anyone could remember. If Celine had gone there, willingly or not, she would be well within Kale's reach, and far from any help Draven's pack could easily provide. Draven wasted no time deliberating. He called together his most trusted warriors that same evening, a small group, chosen not for size or brute strength but for loyalty and discretion, because whatever was happening involved politics as delicate as it was dangerous, and a heavy-handed approach risked making things worse for Celine rather than better. Among them was a sharp-eyed tracker named Aldrich, known throughout the pack for his ability to read a trail that others would miss entirely, and a young but fiercely capable fighter named Marielle, whose loyalty to the royal family ran deep enough that she had once turned down an offer to lead her own smaller pack, simply to remain close to the ones she considered family. That night, sleep did not come easily, but when it finally did, the dream returned, sharper than before, as though the newly gained knowledge had somehow strengthened the thread between them. He found himself again in the narrow stone room, though this time, Celine was not alone. A figure stood near the door, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by shadow, but his posture radiated a kind of cold authority that made Draven's instincts flare with immediate hostility even before he could make out any features clearly. Celine's eyes flicked toward Draven the moment he appeared, and he saw something in her expression shift. Not fear exactly, but a fierce and careful control, the look of someone determined not to let an enemy see how afraid they truly were. She did not speak directly to Draven this time, as though she sensed the figure in the shadows might somehow perceive more than he should. Instead, she looked at Draven for one long moment, and he felt, rather than heard, a wave of feeling pass through the bond between them. Not words this time, but something rawer and more immediate. "Stay away, not yet, it's not safe." He woke with his jaw clenched so tightly it ached, frustration boiling in him at the idea of staying away from her, when every part of him screamed to ride out that very night and tear down whatever walls stood between them. But he trusted her judgment even now, especially now, knowing what she had already sacrificed to protect the people she loved. If she believed rushing in blindly would only make things worse, he owed it to her to listen, even as every instinct in his body rebelled against patience. The following days became a careful balance between urgency and strategy. Draven sent Aldrich ahead as a scout, instructed to move quietly along the border of Kael's territory and gather whatever information he could, without revealing that anyone from Draven's pack was looking for the missing queen. Meanwhile, Draven himself worked to strengthen alliances with neighboring packs, who might be willing to lend support if the situation escalated into open conflict, though he made every effort to keep the true nature of the crisis quiet, unwilling to let word spread that might reach Kael and put Celine in greater danger before Draven was ready to act. It was during this waiting period, difficult and tense as it was, that Draven began to understand something new about his mate, something he had perhaps always known, but never fully appreciated until circumstances forced him to see it clearly. Celine was not simply the gentle, warm presence he had fallen in love with during quiet evenings in the castle library, the woman who read to the pups in the nursery, and who always seemed to know exactly the right words to soothe an anxious member of the pack. She was also fiercely brave, capable of making devastating sacrifices without flinching, capable of walking directly into danger, with her chin held high because she believed it was the only way to protect what mattered most to her. He had known her as his queen and his mate, but only now, faced with her absence, did he begin to fully understand her as a warrior in her own right, one who fought her battles not always with claws and strength, but with courage and careful, quiet resolve. Aldrich returned 4 days later with information that both confirmed their worst fears and offered the first real hope of a path forward. Kael's territory was heavily guarded, more heavily than usual, suggesting that whatever plans he had for Celine, he was determined to protect them from outside interference. But Aldrich had also managed to learn, through careful observation and a few cautious conversations with wolves from Kael's own territory who seemed less than fully loyal to their alpha, that Kael intended to force a marriage between himself and Celine, using the old broken betrothal as his justification, and that he planned to hold the ceremony within a matter of weeks, before anyone could organize a serious challenge to stop him. The news landed like a physical blow, a forced marriage. Draven had known, on some level, that Kael's ambitions likely involved claiming Celine for himself, given the history Fenwick had described, but hearing it, confirmed as an active and imminent plan, made his fury burn hotter than anything he had felt since the morning he first woke to find her gone. He would not allow it. He could not allow it, not while breath remained in his body, and the knowledge of a deadline, however cruel, at least gave him something concrete to plan against, rather than the shapeless dread that had haunted him for days. That night, the dream came again, and this time, Celine appeared to be alone, sitting near a small barred window, through which faint moonlight fell across her face. She looked thinner than he remembered, tired in a way that made his chest ache, but her eyes were sharp and alert, and when she saw him, relief and something fiercer passed across her features. This time she spoke more clearly than she had before, as though whatever force allowed these dreams to connect them was growing stronger with each night that passed. She told him, in fragments and half-finished sentences that still managed to convey more than whole conversations might have, that she was being watched constantly, that any attempt to escape on her own would likely fail and could put her family in even greater danger, but that Cale, for all his cruelty, seemed unwilling to harm her outright, believing her more valuable as an unwilling bride than as a martyr. She told him she had been trying to delay the ceremony however she could, feigning illness, insisting on lengthy traditional preparations that Cale, for reasons of his own pride and desire for a legitimate claim, seemed reluctant to skip entirely. Draven, listening in the strange, half-formed logic of the dream, promised her he was coming, that he would not let Cale complete whatever twisted plan he had set into motion, and though he could not be entirely certain how much of his own words reached her clearly, he saw something in her face soften at the promise, a small flicker of the woman he had married, shining through the exhaustion and fear that had settled over her features. Before the dream faded, she managed one more clear sentence, her voice trembling but determined. "Come for me, but come carefully. He is not a man who loses gracefully." He woke with that warning ringing in his mind, understanding immediately that whatever plan he crafted to save her would need to be as much about strategy and patience as it was about strength and speed. Cale was not some minor threat to be overwhelmed through brute force alone. He was a calculating alpha who had waited years to enact his plan, and who would not hesitate to act ruthlessly if he sensed his prize slipping away. Draven called his war council together that very morning, and for the first time since Celine's disappearance, he felt something shift inside him, from raw desperation into focused, deliberate purpose. He was no longer simply searching. He was preparing to fight for everything that mattered most to him, and he intended to win. News of the Queen's disappearance could not stay contained within the castle walls forever, and by the time Draven had gathered his war council for the third time that week, whispers had already begun spreading through the villages under his protection. Some of what reached his ears was harmless curiosity, the kind of gossip that follows any unusual event in the life of a ruling family. But some of it was sharper, more deliberate, and Draven began to suspect that not all of it was spreading by accident. A young messenger named Oren, who had proven himself trustworthy over several years of quiet service to the crown, approached Draven privately one evening with information that confirmed his growing unease. Oren had overheard, while delivering supplies to a border village, two strangers speaking in low voices about the Queen's absence, with a familiarity that suggested they knew more than simple rumor could explain. When Oren tried to listen more closely, the strangers had noticed him and left quickly, but not before he caught a fragment of their conversation, a mention of payment for information delivered successfully. Draven's stomach turned at the implication. Someone within his own territory, someone with access to information about the pack's movements and the details of Celine's disappearance, was passing information to Cale's people. It explained the guards' apparent readiness at Cale's border, despite Draven's efforts at discretion, and it meant that whatever plan he crafted to rescue Celine would need to account for the possibility of betrayal from within his own walls. He did not want to believe it. The idea that someone he trusted, someone who had sworn loyalty to his family, might be selling information to the very alpha threatening his mate, felt like a wound layered on top of a wound already raw and bleeding. But he had learned enough in his years as king to know that wanting something to be untrue rarely made it so, and he could not afford the luxury of denial while Celine's safety hung in the balance. He assigned Corwin the delicate task of quietly investigating the pack's own ranks, starting with those who had access to the most sensitive information, while keeping the investigation itself as hidden as possible so as not to alert whoever was responsible. It was a slow and careful process, checking movements, cross-referencing who had been present during certain conversations, watching for anyone whose behavior seemed even slightly out of place. Draven hated the necessity of it, hated turning suspicion on his own people when every part of him wanted to focus entirely on finding a way across the border to Celine, but he understood that acting too quickly, without addressing the leak, could doom any rescue attempt before it even began. While Corwin worked on rooting out the informant, Draven turned his attention to the practical matter of how to actually reach Selene without triggering the kind of confrontation that could put her in immediate danger. Kael's territory was well defended, and any large force approaching the border would be noticed long before it arrived, giving Kael ample time to either strengthen his hold on Selene or, worse, use her as leverage against Draven directly. A smaller, more careful approach seemed the only viable option, though it carried its own risks, since a handful of warriors, however skilled, would be badly outnumbered if things went wrong once they crossed into hostile territory. Marielle, ever practical and unafraid to speak her mind even to her king, suggested an approach that Draven had not initially considered. Rather than a direct assault, she proposed they attempt to make contact with wolves inside Kael's own pack, who might be sympathetic to Selene's plight, or at least resentful enough of their alpha's methods to be willing to help in small, quiet ways. Aldrich had already mentioned encountering wolves during his scouting mission, who seemed less than fully devoted to Kael, and Marielle believed that if they could identify and carefully approach even one or two of these individuals, it might provide the kind of inside information and assistance that could make a rescue attempt far more likely to succeed. Draven agreed to the plan, cautiously, understanding the danger involved in trusting strangers from an enemy pack, but also recognizing that Marielle's instincts had rarely steered him wrong in the past. He sent Aldrich back across the border, this time with clearer instructions to seek out and carefully test the loyalties of anyone who seemed dissatisfied with Kael's leadership, while Marielle remained behind to help Corwin with the search for the informant closer to home. The days that followed tested Draven's patience in ways he had not expected. He was a king accustomed to action, to solving problems directly and decisively, and the slow, careful work of gathering information and building alliances chafed against every instinct that told him to simply gather his strongest warriors and march across the border to tear down whatever walls stood between him and his mate. But he forced himself to remain patient, remembering Selene's warning from the dream that Kael was not a man who lost gracefully, and that any misstep could cost her far more than time. The dreams continued, though their clarity varied from night to night, in ways Draven could not fully predict or control. Some nights he saw only fragments, brief glimpses of Selene's face or the sound of her voice, without any clear scene forming around them. Other nights the connection felt stronger, and he found himself standing beside her in that same narrow stone room, able to speak with her almost as clearly as if she stood before him in waking life. On one such night, she told him that the wedding preparations Kael insisted upon were nearing their end, that she had exhausted most of the reasonable excuses she could offer to delay the ceremony further, and that she feared she had perhaps 2 weeks left, 3 at most, before Kael's patience ran out entirely. The pressure of that timeline settled over Draven like a physical weight, and he redoubled his efforts, pushing Corwin for progress on the informant investigation, and sending word to Aldrich, urging him to move as quickly as caution allowed. It was during this tense period that Corwin finally brought him news that both answered one question and raised several more troubling ones. The informant, it turned out, was not a stranger or a recently hired servant with questionable loyalties, but a longtime member of the pack's own guard, a wolf named Perrin, who had served for over a decade, and whom Draven had considered trustworthy without a second thought. When confronted, Perrin did not deny the accusation, though the reasons he gave for his betrayal were more complicated and more painful than simple greed. His younger brother, it emerged, had fallen into debt with dangerous individuals connected to Kael's territory, and threats had been made against the brother's safety unless Perrin agreed to provide information about the royal family's movements and plans. Perrin had convinced himself, in the tangled logic of a man trying to protect someone he loved, that passing along small pieces of information could not cause serious harm, that he was simply buying his brother's safety without truly betraying his king. Draven listened to the explanation with a complicated mixture of anger and something almost like understanding, because he, too, knew what it meant to make difficult choices out of love for someone vulnerable. He did not excuse what Perrin had done, and the consequences for that betrayal would need to be addressed. But he found he could not summon the same fury toward Perrin that he felt toward Kael himself, the true architect of every painful choice being forced upon people who deserved better. Still, The discovery meant they now knew exactly how information had been leaking out, and more importantly, it gave them an opportunity. If Perrin was willing to cooperate, they might be able to use the very channel that had been working against them to instead feed false information to Kale, buying precious time and perhaps even creating openings they could exploit. Perrin agreed readily, desperate to make amends for what he had done, and over the following days, carefully crafted pieces of misleading information began flowing toward Kale's territory through the same channels that had once carried real secrets. Draven's council worked to make the pack appear less prepared and less aware of Celine's true situation than they actually were, hoping to lull Kale into a false sense of security that might make him less vigilant as the wedding date approached. Meanwhile, Aldrich's efforts inside Kale's territory finally began to bear fruit. He managed to make careful contact with a wolf named Isolde, a mid-ranking member of Kale's pack, who had grown increasingly disillusioned with her alpha's methods over the years, particularly his willingness to use threats against innocent family members to achieve his goals. Isolde had apparently known Celine slightly during the years before the broken betrothal, and something in her seemed genuinely troubled by the idea of her old acquaintance being forced into a marriage through coercion and fear. She agreed, cautiously, and after much careful reassurance from Aldrich, to provide what information she could about the layout of Kale's stronghold, the timing of guard rotations, and the specific plans being made for the ceremony itself. With Isolde's information beginning to filter back to Draven, and with Perrin's cooperation feeding false confidence to Kale, the pieces of a real plan finally began to take shape. It would not be a simple rescue. It would require precision, careful timing, and no small amount of courage from everyone involved. But for the first time since that terrible morning, when he woke to an empty bed, Draven felt something other than desperate reactive fear. He felt the steady, focused determination of a king preparing to reclaim what was his, not through reckless force alone, but through patience, strategy, and the kind of careful planning that gave him genuine confidence they might actually succeed. That night, when the dream carried him once more to Celine's side, he told her everything: the informant, the false information now flowing toward Kale, the contact made with Isolde inside the stronghold itself. He watched hope kindle in her tired eyes as she listened, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, she smiled at him fully, the way she used to smile before all of this began, and told him that she had never doubted he would find a way to come for her, only that she had feared what it might cost him to try. He told her it would cost him nothing compared to what it would cost him to lose her, and though the dream faded soon after, as it always did, he carried the warmth of that smile with him into his waking hours, a small but powerful reminder of exactly what he was fighting for. With the informant identified, and a fragile network of allies beginning to form inside Kale's own territory, Draven turned his attention to the details that would decide whether their plan succeeded or ended in disaster. Isolde's information, smuggled carefully to Aldrich through a series of prearranged signals meant to avoid drawing attention, revealed that Kale's stronghold was built into the side of a hill, its lower levels carved directly into stone, with a single main gate heavily guarded at all hours, and a network of smaller passages, known mostly to those who had lived within its walls for years. Celine, according to Isolde, was being kept in a chamber on the lower level, close to the very room Draven had seen in his dreams, its single-barred window facing east toward the rising sun. Guards rotated through 3 shifts, and the changeover between the second and third shift, occurring deep in the night, when exhaustion made even disciplined wolves less alert, offered the narrowest but most promising window of opportunity for anyone attempting to move through the stronghold unnoticed. Draven pored over every detail Isolde provided, cross-referencing it against Aldrich's own observations from his scouting missions, determined to leave nothing to chance. He selected a small team for the rescue itself, understanding that a larger force, however comforting in terms of raw strength, would be far more likely to be noticed and would eliminate any hope of a quiet extraction. Alongside himself, he chose Corwin, whose steady judgment he trusted above almost anyone else, Marielle, whose combat skill and quick thinking had already proven invaluable, and Aldrich, whose knowledge of the terrain and existing relationship with Isolde made him essential to the plan's success. The days leading up to the attempt were filled with careful preparation, quiet drills conducted away from prying eyes, and endless review of the route they intended to take once inside the stronghold. Draven insisted on running through every possible complication, every point where something might go wrong, forcing himself and his small team to consider not just the ideal outcome, but every way the plan might unravel, and what they would do if it did. It was exhausting work, mentally and emotionally, but Draven refused to let hope alone carry them into danger. He wanted preparation, thorough and unflinching, to be their true weapon. Through it all, the dreams continued to connect him with Celine, though as the wedding date drew nearer, her messages grew more urgent, tinged with an anxiety she could not fully hide, even in the strange half-formed logic of shared sleep. She told him that Kale had grown suspicious of her continued delays, that his patience, never abundant to begin with, was fraying visibly, and that she feared he might soon abandon the traditional preparations altogether in favor of a hastily arranged ceremony designed simply to secure his claim before anything could interfere. That warning pushed Draven to move up the timeline of the rescue attempt by several critical days, a decision that added risk, but felt unavoidable given how little time remained. He communicated the change to his team, watched them absorb the added pressure with the same steady resolve they had shown throughout the entire ordeal, and found himself grateful, not for the first time, that he had surrounded himself with wolves capable of such quiet, unwavering courage. Perrin, still working to atone for his earlier betrayal, continued feeding carefully constructed false information toward Kale's territory, information designed to suggest that Draven's pack remained largely unaware of Celine's exact location and unprepared for any kind of rescue attempt. It was a delicate balance, providing enough believable detail to maintain the deception without accidentally revealing anything that might endanger the real plan taking shape in secret. Draven personally reviewed every piece of information before it was sent, unwilling to trust something so critical to chance or oversight. 2 nights before the rescue attempt was scheduled to take place, Draven experienced the most vivid dream yet, one that felt different from the start, charged with an urgency that made his heart race even within the strange logic of sleep. He found himself not in the familiar stone room, but in a wider chamber, decorated with the trappings of formal ceremony, banners hanging from the walls and rows of chairs, arranged as though for a gathering of significant size. Celine stood near the center of the room, dressed not in her own clothing, but in unfamiliar ceremonial robes, her face pale and set in an expression of grim determination that told Draven more than words could have. She saw him and rushed forward this time, closing the distance between them with none of the hesitation she had shown in earlier dreams, and though he could not truly feel her touch, the sensation of her nearness still struck him with startling force. She told him, her words tumbling out quickly, as though she feared the dream might end before she finished speaking, that Kale had moved the ceremony forward, that it was now scheduled for the very night after the one Draven's team had chosen for their rescue attempt, leaving almost no margin for error. Draven felt cold dread settle into his stomach at the news, understanding immediately that any delay or complication in their plan could mean arriving too late to prevent the very outcome they were racing to stop. He told her, as firmly and reassuringly as he could manage, that they would come for her before that nothing would stop him from reaching her in time, and though fear remained plain in her eyes, she nodded, seeming to draw strength from his certainty, even as the dream began to fade around them. He woke before dawn, his mind already racing through every detail of the plan, searching for anything that might be tightened, any risk that might be further reduced given the new and urgent timeline. He called his team together earlier than planned, relayed what he had learned, and watched the atmosphere in the room shift from careful preparation into something sharper, more focused, the particular clarity that comes when a deadline suddenly becomes real and immovable, rather than a distant point on a calendar. Isolde reached through their careful signaling system, confirmed the change in timing, and offered one additional piece of information that gave Draven a small but crucial advantage. She revealed that Kale intended to hold a private gathering the evening before the ceremony, a traditional pre-wedding ritual that would draw many of the stronghold's senior guards away from their usual posts to attend, leaving the lower levels, including the chamber where Celine was kept, more lightly guarded than at any other point in recent weeks. It was, Isolde explained, a narrow opportunity, but it might be the best one they would get. Draven adjusted the plan accordingly, moving the rescue attempt to coincide with this gathering rather than waiting for the original planned night. Understanding that the compressed timeline left even less room for mistakes, but offering their best realistic chance of success. His team absorbed the change without complaint, each of them understanding exactly what was at stake, not just for their queen, but for the stability and honor of the entire pack that depended on her safe return. The night before they were set to depart, Draven found himself unable to sleep at all, too aware of everything that could go wrong, too conscious of how much rested on the plan they had built from fragments of dreams, stolen information, and careful trust placed in allies from an enemy pack. He walked the castle halls alone in the deep hours of the night, passing the empty nursery where the pups slept peacefully, unaware of the danger their queen faced, passing the library, where Celine's book still sat unfinished on its small table, passing the garden where he had first found her ring left behind on that terrible morning that now felt like it belonged to another lifetime entirely. He allowed himself, for just a few moments, to feel the full weight of everything that had happened since that morning, the fear, the grief, the slow and painful process of understanding exactly what Celine had sacrificed and why. He thought of her courage, her willingness to walk alone into danger rather than let harm reach the people she loved, and he found in that memory not just sorrow, but a fierce and steady pride that helped settle the anxious pounding of his heart. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, she had already proven herself the bravest wolf he had ever known, and he intended to prove himself worthy of standing beside her, not by rushing in with reckless fury, but by fighting for her, with the same careful, determined love she had shown in trying to protect him. As the first hints of dawn began to touch the horizon, Draven returned to his chamber, gathered the small collection of weapons and supplies he would carry with him, and made his way to meet his team at the appointed gathering point, just beyond the castle walls. The journey to the border would take most of the day, timed carefully, so they would arrive near Kael's stronghold as evening fell and the private gathering drew the senior guards away from their posts. There would be no turning back once they crossed into hostile territory, no second chances if something went wrong, only the plan they had built with such painstaking care, and the fierce determination that had carried Draven through every dark hour since the morning his mate disappeared without a word, leaving only a ring and a promise, spoken in a dream, that he intended to keep no matter the cost. The journey toward Kael's territory took them through forest paths that grew thicker and more tangled the further they traveled from familiar ground, and Draven found himself grateful for Aldrich's steady guidance, since the tracker seemed to know every subtle landmark that separated the safe trails from the ones more likely to draw unwanted attention. They moved quickly, but carefully, pausing often to listen for signs of patrols, speaking only when necessary, and always in voices pitched low enough to disappear into the natural sounds of the woods around them. By the time the sun began sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red, they had reached a small rise overlooking the valley, where Kael's stronghold sat, carved into the hillside, exactly as Isolde had described it. Even from this distance, Draven could see the scale of the place, its walls thick and imposing, torches already beginning to flicker to life along its ramparts as evening approached. His stomach tightened at the sight, not from fear for himself, but from the sharp awareness that Celine had been trapped within those walls for weeks, isolated and afraid, while he had been searching desperately for any way to reach her. They settled into a concealed position among the trees to wait for the signal Isolde had promised, a lantern set in a specific window that would indicate when the private gathering had begun and the lower levels stood most lightly guarded. The waiting stretched Draven's nerves thin, every passing minute feeling far longer than it should have, until finally, as full darkness settled over the valley, a single small light appeared in one of the upper windows of the stronghold, exactly where Isolde had said it would be. Draven signaled his team forward, and they moved down from the rise with the practiced quiet of wolves who had spent years training for exactly this kind of careful, dangerous work. Aldrich led them along a route that avoided the main gate entirely, following instead a narrow game trail that connected to a smaller side entrance Isolde had described, one used mostly by servants and rarely watched closely, except during the busiest hours of the day. At this hour, With most of the senior guards drawn away to attend the ceremony gathering, the entrance stood watched by only a single guard, easily and quietly subdued by Marielle, before he could raise any alarm. Inside, the stronghold felt different from what Draven had imagined during all those long nights of planning, colder and more oppressive, its stone corridors lit by widely spaced torches that left long stretches of shadow between pools of flickering light. They moved through those shadows carefully, following the path Isolde had mapped out for them, descending level by level toward the lower chambers where Celine was being held. They encountered 2 more guards along the way. Both dealt with quickly and quietly, subdued rather than seriously harmed, since Draven had been firm in his instructions that unnecessary violence would only complicate their situation and risk drawing attention before they could complete the rescue. Each encounter added tension to the already tightly wound atmosphere, every corner they turned bringing the possibility of discovery, every distant sound making Draven's heart lurch with the fear that their careful plan was about to collapse. Finally, they reached the narrow stone room Draven recognized instantly from his dreams, its single barred window facing east, exactly as he had seen it so many times while sleeping beside an empty bed back home. A single guard stood outside the heavy wooden door, clearly less alert than he should have been, likely assuming the private gathering elsewhere in the stronghold meant little chance of trouble reaching this quiet corridor. Corwin moved forward and subdued him swiftly, and within moments, Draven found himself standing before the door that separated him from the mate he had been fighting to reach for what felt like an eternity. He pushed it open, and there she was. Celine sat near the barred window, exactly as she had appeared in his dreams, though seeing her in waking life struck him with a force no dream had ever managed to match. She turned at the sound of the door, and for one suspended moment, disbelief and hope warred across her features before recognition broke through completely, and she rose so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. Draven crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since that terrible morning weeks ago, he allowed himself to simply feel the overwhelming relief of holding her again, solid and real, and finally within his reach. She clung to him tightly, her whole body trembling, and though there was no time for the kind of reunion either of them truly wanted, the brief embrace still carried the weight of everything they had endured to reach this single moment. Draven pulled back just enough to look at her face, brushing his thumb gently across her cheek, and told her they needed to move quickly, that every moment they lingered increased the risk of discovery. She nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes, and though exhaustion and strain were plainly visible in her face, he saw beneath it the same fierce resolve that had carried her through weeks of captivity without breaking. They began making their way back through the corridors they had come from, moving as quickly as caution allowed, but fortune, which had favored them thus far, chose that moment to turn against them. As they approached the side entrance that had let them in undetected, a group of guards returning early from the gathering rounded the corner directly ahead, and recognition flashed across their faces, almost instantly, at the sight of armed strangers moving through the stronghold, with the missing queen among them. The corridor erupted into sudden chaos. Shouts rang out, guards reaching for weapons, and Draven positioned himself immediately between Celine and the approaching threat, every instinct honed by years of leadership and combat snapping into sharp focus. Corwin and Marielle moved to flank the guards, working to create an opening while Aldrich guided Celine back the way they had come, searching desperately for an alternate route that might avoid the growing commotion. The fight that followed was fast and brutal in its intensity, though Draven's team fought with the discipline and coordination born of years working together, managing to hold their own against guards caught off guard and disorganized by the sudden intrusion. Draven himself moved with a ferocity he rarely allowed himself to show, every strike carrying the accumulated weight of weeks of fear and desperation finally given an outlet, but he remained careful, even in the heat of battle, unwilling to let his anger override the tactical awareness that had kept his team alive through the most dangerous parts of the rescue thus far. Alarm bells began ringing through the stronghold, confirming their worst fears that the alert had spread beyond the immediate corridor, and Draven understood with grim clarity that their careful, quiet extraction had transformed into something far more dangerous. More guards would be converging on their position within minutes, and if they did not find a way out quickly, They risked being trapped entirely within walls that had been built specifically to be difficult to breach from the outside and equally difficult to escape from within. Isolde appeared suddenly from a side passage, having heard the commotion and recognized the danger her new allies now faced. She gestured urgently toward a narrow maintenance corridor Draven's team had not known existed, explaining quickly that it led toward an old drainage tunnel, used rarely enough that it might offer an escape route the guards would not immediately think to cover. It was a risk, trusting a passage they had not scouted in advance, but with guards closing in from multiple directions, it represented their best remaining option. Draven made the decision instantly, trusting the instincts that had guided him throughout this entire desperate endeavor, and the group moved quickly into the narrow passage Isolde indicated, Corwin and Marielle holding the rear to slow any pursuit, while Draven kept close to Celine, refusing to let more than a few feet separate them now that he had finally reached her side again. The passage was tight and dark, forcing them to move in single file, the sounds of pursuit and alarm growing more distant behind them as they pressed forward through the damp, narrow tunnel. They emerged finally into the cool night air at the base of the hillside, some distance from the main stronghold walls, breathing hard and covered in dust from the tunnel, but alive and, most importantly, together. There was no time to celebrate the small victory, though, as shouts and the distant glow of torches indicated the pursuit had not been fully thrown off, and Draven knew they needed to reach the safety of the deeper forest before Kale's forces could organize a proper hunt. They ran, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed, Celine keeping pace despite the exhaustion clearly wearing at her after weeks of captivity, her determination to remain free apparently overriding whatever physical toll the ordeal had taken. Draven stayed close beside her, ready to offer support the moment she needed it, though she pushed through the difficult terrain with a resilience that filled him with renewed admiration for the strength she had shown throughout this entire crisis. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit gradually grew fainter as they put more distance between themselves and the stronghold, cutting through paths Aldrich knew well enough to navigate even in the darkness, until finally, as the first pale hints of dawn began touching the eastern sky, they crossed back into territory that belonged unmistakably to Draven's own pack, safe ground where Kale's forces would not dare to follow without risking open war between their two territories. Only then did the group finally slow, allowing themselves a moment to catch their breath and absorb the reality of what they had accomplished. Celine turned to Draven, her face streaked with dust and exhaustion, but her eyes bright with an emotion too complicated to name simply as relief, and though neither of them spoke immediately, the look that passed between them carried everything words might have struggled to express. They had done it. Against all the danger and uncertainty of the past weeks, they had found their way back to each other, and though Draven understood the danger from Kale was far from fully resolved, in that moment, standing on familiar ground with his mate finally safe beside him, nothing else seemed to matter quite as much as the simple, overwhelming fact that she was here, alive and free. They did not linger long at the border once they crossed into safe territory, understanding that true safety still lay a considerable distance away, back within the walls of the castle, where healers and rest and proper protection awaited. Draven sent Aldrich ahead on the fastest path to alert the pack of their success and to ensure that everything would be ready the moment they arrived, while the rest of the group continued at a steadier pace, mindful of Celine's exhaustion after weeks of captivity and the physical toll of their desperate escape. As they walked, Celine finally began to share the details of what had happened to her since that terrible morning, speaking haltingly at first, as though the words had been locked away for so long that releasing them felt strange and unfamiliar. She told Draven about the threats that had begun arriving weeks before her disappearance, delivered through channels so carefully hidden that she had been certain, at least initially, that she could handle the situation quietly, without ever needing to burden him with the danger. She explained how the first message had come disguised as an ordinary piece of correspondence, slipped among other letters in a way that nearly caused her to miss it entirely, and how the words within had chilled her immediately, invoking a promise from her youth she had long believed forgotten and buried. She had not wanted to believe at first that Kale would truly act on such an old grievance, but subsequent messages had made his intentions increasingly clear, each one more specific about the consequences that would follow if she refused to cooperate. Celine admitted, with visible difficulty, that she had considered telling Draven from the very beginning, that the urge to share her fear with him had been strong and constant, but that each time she nearly did, doubt crept in alongside it. She worried that involving him directly would only escalate the danger, that Cale's threats against Draven himself might become more immediate and more real the moment their enemy realized the king was actively working to counter his plans. She had convinced herself, in the end, that leaving quietly and buying time through compliance was the safer path, one that might protect everyone she loved, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness and freedom in the process. Draven listened to all of this with a heavy heart, understanding the logic behind her choices, even as every part of him wished she had trusted him enough to share the burden from the start. He told her, gently but firmly, that he did not blame her for the choice she had made, recognizing the impossible position she had been placed in, but that he hoped she now understood he would always rather stand beside her, facing danger together, than be kept safely ignorant while she suffered alone. Celine's eyes filled with tears at his words, and she admitted that the weeks of captivity had taught her exactly that lesson, that isolation, even when chosen with the best intentions, only compounded fear rather than easing it, and that she would never again try to face something so significant without him by her side. She spoke, too, of her time within Cale's stronghold, describing the careful game she had played to delay the wedding preparations, feigning illness when she could, insisting on lengthy traditional rituals she knew Cale's pride would not allow him to skip entirely, all while watching for any opportunity to communicate with the outside world or find some way to escape on her own. She described Cale himself, not as some cartoonish villain, but as a calculating and deeply proud alpha, convinced entirely of his own righteousness, believing that reclaiming the broken betrothal was not cruelty, but simple justice long overdue. That certainty, she explained, had made him dangerous in ways that pure malice might not have been, because he seemed genuinely unable to understand why anyone would resist what he considered a fair and reasonable claim. By the time they reached the outer edges of Draven's territory, word of their return had already spread, and small groups of pack members began gathering along the road, watching with a mixture of relief and awe as their missing queen walked among them once more, tired and travel-worn, but unmistakably alive and free. Whispers that had once carried doubt and rumor now shifted into something closer to wonder, and Draven noticed the change ripple through the gathered wolves as clearly as a change in the wind. When they finally reached the castle itself, Celine was immediately taken to the healers, who examined her carefully and pronounced her, to everyone's relief, largely unharmed physically, though clearly in need of rest and proper nourishment after weeks of stress and captivity. Draven refused to leave her side throughout the examination, and though the healers gently suggested he might benefit from rest himself, he waved away every suggestion, unwilling to let more than a few feet separate him from his mate after everything they had endured to be reunited. That evening, once Celine had eaten and rested for several hours, the two of them sat together in the quiet privacy of their chamber, the same room where Draven had woken weeks earlier to find her missing. The ring, which he had kept close to him throughout the entire ordeal, carried in a small pouch against his chest during the rescue itself, now returned to its rightful place on her finger, and the sight of it there again brought a wave of emotion neither of them tried particularly hard to hide. Celine finally asked him, quietly, about the dreams, curious how much he had understood and how the strange connection between them had worked, since from her side, she had experienced something similar, glimpses of him appearing to her during the loneliest and most frightening hours of her captivity, though she had not always been certain whether what she saw was truly a connection or simply her own desperate mind conjuring comfort where none existed. Draven told her everything, from that first devastating dream in the garden to the increasingly clear conversations that had guided much of his search and eventual rescue plan, and Celine listened with wide, wondering eyes, admitting that she had clung to those dream conversations as her only source of hope through the darkest stretches of her captivity. Their bond, they both agreed, had proven itself stronger and more resilient than either of them had fully understood before this crisis forced it to be tested in ways neither could have imagined. It was a small comfort amid the larger uncertainties still facing them, since Draven knew, even in that quiet, relieved evening, that Cale would not simply accept the failure of his plan without response. The broken betrothal that had started this entire ordeal remained a wound Cale clearly still considered unhealed, and a king proud and calculating enough to plan such an elaborate scheme over an old grievance was unlikely to let a single failed attempt end his ambitions entirely. Still, for that one evening, Draven allowed himself and Celine the simple gift of being together, safe within their own walls, free from the immediate threat that had shadowed them for weeks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the difficult work of addressing rumors that had spread through the pack, the delicate diplomacy required to prevent Cale's anger from erupting into open conflict, and the lingering question of what consequences, if any, should follow Perrin's earlier betrayal, despite his later cooperation. But tonight, Draven simply held his mate close, grateful beyond words for the strange and powerful bond that had guided him through dreams and danger alike to bring her safely home. The peace of that first night together did not last long. 3 days after Celine's return, a messenger arrived at the castle gates bearing a formal letter sealed with Cale's own mark, and the moment Draven broke the seal and read its contents, he understood that the conflict they had hoped to avoid was no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate and pressing reality. Cale's letter was carefully worded, formal in the way that only thinly veiled threats tend to be, expressing outrage at what he described as the unlawful abduction of his rightful betrothed from within his own territory, and demanding her immediate return, along with appropriate compensation for the insult dealt to his honor. Draven read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each pass, before passing it to Corwin and the assembled council members, who had gathered the moment word arrived of a messenger from Cale's territory. The room fell into tense discussion, some voices urging caution and diplomacy, others arguing that any response short of firm rejection would only embolden Cale further. Celine, present for the discussion despite the healer's continued insistence that she rest, listened with a grim expression that told Draven she had expected exactly this kind of response from the man who had held her captive for weeks. She spoke up during a lull in the debate, her voice steady despite the exhaustion still visible in her posture, reminding the council that Cale's sense of honor was, in her experience, deeply tied to his public image among his own pack and the wider region. He would not want to appear as though he had lost something valuable without a fight, but he also would not want to appear as the aggressor in an unprovoked war, particularly not over a betrothal most outside observers would consider broken and abandoned years ago. This insight, born from her weeks of careful observation while held within his stronghold, offered the council a valuable window into how they might navigate the crisis without immediately resorting to open conflict. Draven called upon Fenwick once more, whose knowledge of old pack law and historical precedent proved invaluable in crafting a formal response. Together, they drafted a reply that firmly rejected Cale's claim, citing clear historical precedent establishing that a betrothal broken by mutual agreement of both families, as the original arrangement between Celine's family and Cale's had been, held no binding force decades later, particularly once one party had entered into a legitimate and recognized marriage bond, as Celine had done with Draven. The letter was respectful in tone, but unyielding in substance, making clear that any attempt to press the matter further would be viewed as an act of aggression against a sovereign and allied territory, one that Draven's pack, along with its allies, would not hesitate to answer in kind. Sending that letter felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, uncertain whether Cale would accept the firm boundary being drawn, or whether his wounded pride would push him toward the very conflict everyone hoped to avoid. In the days that followed, Draven worked tirelessly to strengthen his position, reaching out to neighboring packs with whom his family had long maintained friendly relations, explaining the situation honestly, and requesting their support should Cale choose to escalate the matter into open aggression. Most responded favorably, several outright condemning Cale's actions as they learned the details of what had truly happened to Celine, and the growing show of unified opposition began to shift the balance of power in ways that Draven hoped might discourage Cale from pursuing further conflict. Perrin, meanwhile, faced the pack's judgment for his earlier betrayal, and Draven, mindful of the complicated circumstances that had driven the guard's actions, chose a path that balanced accountability with mercy. Perrin was stripped of his position within the Royal Guard, a consequence he accepted without protest, understanding fully that trust once broken could not simply be restored through good intentions alone. But Draven also arranged, quietly and without public announcement, for assistance to be extended to Perrin's brother, addressing the debt and the dangerous circumstances that had made him vulnerable to Kael's manipulation in the first place. It was not a perfect resolution, but it reflected the kind of balanced justice Draven believed his position required, punishment tempered by understanding of the genuine fear that had driven a fundamentally loyal wolf toward betrayal. As word spread through the pack about the true circumstances of Celine's disappearance, the atmosphere shifted dramatically from the doubt and quiet rumor that had followed her absence towards something closer to reverence. Wolves who had once whispered about a queen who abandoned her king now spoke instead of a queen who had sacrificed her own freedom and safety to protect the people she loved, and Draven watched with quiet satisfaction as Celine's reputation within the pack transformed from uncertainty into genuine, deep respect. She bore the attention with characteristic grace, never seeking praise for what she had endured, but accepting the pack's renewed loyalty and warmth with the same steady dignity she had shown throughout her captivity. Still, the threat from Kael remained unresolved, hanging over the pack like a storm cloud that had not yet decided whether to break. Reports from Aldrich's continued network of contacts within Kael's territory suggested that the rejected marriage claim had indeed wounded his pride severely, and that he was gathering support among a faction of his own pack who favored a more aggressive response, though other voices within his territory, including Isolde and those who shared her growing disillusionment, argued strongly against the folly of war over a claim most considered legally and morally indefensible. The tension came to a head roughly 2 weeks after Celine's return, when word arrived that Kael intended to personally lead a delegation to the border between their two territories, demanding a face-to-face meeting with Draven to discuss what he called a final resolution to the matter. The message carried an unmistakable edge of challenge beneath its formal language, and Draven understood immediately that however this meeting unfolded, it would likely determine whether the conflict ended in lasting peace or erupted into the kind of open warfare that could cost countless lives on both sides. Celine, upon hearing the news, insisted immediately that she accompany Draven to the meeting, despite the obvious danger of placing herself once more within reach of the Alpha, who had held her captive for weeks. Draven resisted the idea at first, every protective instinct in him rebelling against the thought of exposing her to that danger again, so soon after her rescue. But Celine remained firm, arguing that her presence, and her own testimony regarding Kael's actions, might prove crucial in swaying any watching allies or neutral parties toward a clear understanding of who bore true responsibility for the crisis. More than that, she said quietly, taking his hands in hers, she refused to let fear dictate her choices any longer. She had spent weeks being controlled by the threat of what Kael might do, and she was not willing to let that fear continue shaping her actions now that she was finally free. Draven, recognizing both the wisdom in her argument and the fierce determination in her eyes that reminded him so powerfully of the courage that had first drawn him to her, finally agreed, though he insisted on bringing sufficient protection to ensure her safety, regardless of how the meeting unfolded. Corwin and Marielle would accompany them, along with a contingent of trusted warriors positioned at a discreet distance, ready to respond immediately should Kael attempt any treachery during what was meant to be a diplomatic exchange. As preparations for the meeting proceeded, Draven found himself reflecting on how far they had come since that terrible morning when he woke to an empty bed and a single ring left behind on the windowsill. The dreams that had guided him through the darkest weeks of the search had faded somewhat in frequency now that Celine was physically present beside him each night, though occasionally, when sleep proved fitful, he still felt the faint echo of that connection, as though the bond between them, once tested so severely, had left behind a permanent deepening of whatever mysterious thread joined their spirits together. Whatever happened at the coming meeting with Kael, Draven understood that he and Celine had already survived something that might have broken a lesser bond entirely, and that shared survival gave him a quiet, steady confidence as they prepared to face whatever confrontation still lay ahead. The meeting place was a wide clearing near the contested forest that separated the two territories, chosen for its neutrality and its open sightlines, which made any attempt at ambush considerably more difficult for either side to conceal. Draven arrived with Celine beside him, flanked by Corwin and Marielle, while a larger contingent of warriors waited at the edge of the tree line, close enough to respond quickly if needed, but far enough to avoid appearing overtly aggressive during what was meant to remain a diplomatic exchange. Cale arrived shortly after, and Draven studied him carefully as he approached, taking the measure of the alpha who had caused so much fear and disruption over the preceding weeks. He was tall, as Isolde and Aldrich's descriptions had suggested, with a bearing that radiated confidence bordering on arrogance, his expression carefully controlled, but unable to fully mask the flicker of surprise, and something like frustration, that crossed his features when his gaze landed on Selene standing firmly at Draven's side, clearly unbroken and unafraid, despite everything he had put her through. The formal exchanges began stiffly, each side stating their position with the careful, measured language of diplomacy, though the tension beneath the words remained palpable. Cale reiterated his claim regarding the old betrothal, insisting that honor and tradition demanded its fulfillment, regardless of the years that had passed, or the marriage Selene had since entered into. Draven countered firmly, citing the same historical precedent Fenwick had helped him research, making clear that no reasonable interpretation of pack law supported Cale's position, and that his actions in threatening Selene's family and holding her captive constituted a far greater violation of honor than any perceived slight from a broken betrothal decades old. It was Selene, however, who ultimately shifted the tone of the confrontation most decisively. She stepped forward, addressing Cale directly with a calm, steady voice that carried clearly across the clearing, refusing to let herself be spoken about, as though she were merely a prize being contested between two men, rather than a person with her own voice and agency. She told him plainly that she had never agreed to the betrothal in the first place, that it had been arranged by her family when she was still a child, with no say in the matter, and that her family's later decision to set it aside had been entirely within their right. She told him, further, that his choice to threaten her loved ones and hold her captive rather than simply accepting that reality had cost him any claim to the honor he insisted he was trying to protect. Cale's expression darkened as she spoke, and for a moment, Draven tensed, ready to step between them if the alpha's temper flared into something more dangerous. But Cale, whatever his faults, seemed unwilling to let his anger override his awareness of the watching warriors on both sides and the presence of allied packs who had made clear their support for Draven and Selene's position. Instead, he demanded to know why she had gone along with his plans for as long as she had, if she had never intended to honor the arrangement, and Selene answered without hesitation, telling him that she had tried to buy time precisely because she hoped, foolishly perhaps, that reason might eventually prevail, that he might come to understand the injustice of what he was demanding, without forcing a full confrontation between their two territories. The exchange that followed grew increasingly heated, though it remained, crucially, verbal rather than violent, each side laying out grievances and positions with an intensity that made clear how close the entire situation had come to erupting into open war. Draven watched Cale carefully throughout, noting the moments where the alpha's certainty seemed to waver, where the weight of standing before assembled witnesses, including representatives from neutral packs who had traveled to observe the meeting, seemed to remind him that his actions would be judged not just by his own pride, but by the broader community, whose respect he still needed to maintain his standing. It was Isolde, unexpectedly, who provided the turning point in the confrontation. She stepped forward from among Cale's own delegation, and Draven saw genuine surprise cross Cale's face at her willingness to speak against him publicly, having apparently not realized the depth of her disillusionment until that very moment. She spoke carefully but firmly, confirming details of Selene's captivity that corroborated everything Draven and Selene had already stated, and adding her own perspective as a member of Cale's pack who had watched his obsession with the old betrothal grow increasingly disconnected from the genuine well-being of his own people, many of whom, she said, had grown weary of a leader more focused on old grievances than on the prosperity and safety of those he was meant to protect. The weight of her testimony, delivered by someone from within his own ranks, rather than an outside party with obvious motive to oppose him, seemed to land on Cale with unexpected force. Draven watched the alpha's posture shift, his earlier confidence giving way to something more uncertain as he registered, perhaps for the first time, that his own pack's loyalty might not be as absolute as he had assumed. that continuing to pursue this conflict might cost him more than simply the prize of a claimed bride, but the respect and support of his own people as well. The neutral observers present, representatives from 3 allied packs who had come specifically to witness the confrontation and report back to their own leaders, exchanged quiet glances among themselves, and Draven understood that the tide of opinion in the wider region was shifting decisively away from Kael's position. Whatever he decided in this moment, he would be doing so with the knowledge that continued aggression risked not just war with Draven's pack, but isolation from the broader network of alliances that had, until now, treated him as a respected if sometimes difficult neighbor. Kael was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, clearly wrestling with pride that did not wish to concede, but pragmatism that could not ignore the reality laid bare before him. Finally he spoke, his voice controlled but stripped of its earlier arrogance, stating that he would withdraw his claim regarding the betrothal, though he insisted, in a final attempt to preserve some measure of dignity, that he did so not out of any admission of wrongdoing, but simply because continuing the dispute served no one's true interests any longer. Draven, understanding the value of allowing a proud man some path to retreat without complete humiliation, accepted the concession without pressing further. But he made clear, in careful but unmistakable terms, that any future attempt to threaten Selene or her family would be met with the full and immediate response of his pack and its allies. Kael accepted the terms, and though the 2 alphas did not part as friends, they parted with the tension of open conflict finally, genuinely diffused, replaced by the wary but functional peace that so often exists between territories that have tested each other's resolve and found reason to step back from the brink. As the delegations began dispersing, Isolde approached Selene and Draven privately, and Selene embraced her warmly, thanking her for the courage it had taken to speak against her own alpha in front of so many witnesses. Isolde admitted quietly that she did not know what her future within Kael's pack would look like after such a public break with his position, and Draven, without hesitation, offered her a place among his own pack should she ever wish to leave Kael's territory, an offer she accepted with visible relief and gratitude. As they made their way back toward home, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the forest, Draven finally allowed the tension that had gripped him for weeks to ease from his shoulders. The confrontation had gone as well as he could have reasonably hoped, better perhaps, given how easily it might have spiraled into the kind of violence that would have cost lives on both sides. Selene walked close beside him, her hand held firmly in his, and though the road home still stretched ahead of them, both understood that the most dangerous chapter of their ordeal had finally, truly come to an end. The weeks that followed the confrontation with Kael brought a kind of gradual healing to the pack that Draven had not fully anticipated, though looking back, he understood it should not have surprised him. A community that had endured weeks of uncertainty, rumor, and fear needed time to process everything that had happened, and he made it a priority, alongside Selene, to ensure that process unfolded in the open rather than in whispered corners and half-understood gossip. He called a formal gathering in the Great Hall, inviting every member of the pack who wished to attend, and there, standing beside Selene before the assembled crowd, he told the full story of what had happened, leaving out none of the difficult truths. He spoke of the threats Selene had received, the impossible choice she had faced, and the courage it had taken for her to walk away from everything she loved in an attempt to protect them all, without ever asking for recognition or thanks. He spoke of the search that followed, the strange and powerful dreams that had guided him, the careful work of allies both within and outside the pack who had helped make her rescue possible, and the tense negotiation that had finally secured a lasting peace with Kael's territory. The hall fell silent as he spoke, and when he finished, Selene added her own words, thanking the pack for their patience and their loyalty during a time when so much remained unknown, and acknowledging openly that she understood how her sudden disappearance must have looked from the outside, how easily doubt and rumor could take root in the absence of clear explanation. She told them she had made the choice she believed was right at the time, though she had since learned, through painful experience, the value of trusting those who loved her enough to share even the heaviest burdens, rather than carrying them alone. The response from the assembled pack was overwhelming, a wave of support and renewed loyalty that brought visible emotion to Selene's face, as wolves young and old came forward in the following days, to express their gratitude for her sacrifice and their relief at her safe return. The rumors that had once painted her as fearful or uncommitted dissolved entirely, replaced by a story that would be told and retold throughout the pack for generations, of a queen brave enough to walk alone into danger, and a king determined enough to follow the faintest thread of connection across impossible distance to bring her home. Perrin, too, found a measure of peace in the aftermath, as word of his cooperation in feeding false information toward Cale's territory during the critical final days before the rescue became known throughout the pack, tempering the earlier judgment of his betrayal with recognition of the genuine remorse and eventual courage he had shown in helping to correct his mistake. He remained without his former position in the Royal Guard, a consequence he continued to accept without complaint, but he found new purpose working alongside the pack's border patrols, a role that allowed him to continue serving the community he loved while rebuilding the trust his earlier actions had damaged. Isolde arrived at the castle roughly a month after the confrontation with Cale, having finally decided that her position within her former Alpha's territory had become untenable following her public break with him. She was welcomed warmly by both Draven and Selene, who had not forgotten the crucial role she had played in making the rescue possible, and she settled gradually into pack life, forming particularly close friendships with Marielle, whose own fierce loyalty and directness seemed to resonate with Isolde's similarly forthright nature. Draven and Selene, in the quiet moments they finally found time to share, amid the ongoing work of rebuilding trust and stability within the pack, spoke often of everything they had learned through the ordeal, both about the strength of their bond and about the ways they wanted their partnership to function differently moving forward. Selene admitted that her instinct to protect Draven by carrying difficult burdens alone remained strong, a habit formed perhaps from years of watching her own family navigate political dangers quietly rather than openly, but she committed herself, with visible determination, to fighting that instinct whenever it arose, choosing instead to trust Draven with whatever weighed on her, however frightening the prospect of sharing it might feel. Draven, for his part, acknowledged his own role in the pattern that had allowed her fear to grow unchecked for weeks before her disappearance. Admitting that he had noticed her growing quietness and distraction in the weeks before she vanished, but had chosen to respect what he assumed was simply a need for privacy rather than pressing her to share what troubled her. He promised, in turn, to pay closer attention going forward, to trust his instincts when something felt wrong between them, rather than assuming silence always meant nothing significant lay beneath it. These conversations, difficult as they sometimes were, brought them closer together, in ways that Draven suspected might not have happened without the crucible of crisis, forcing both of them to confront their own patterns and assumptions. Their bond, already strong before Selene's disappearance, had been tested in ways few mated pairs ever experienced, and though neither of them would have wished such a trial upon themselves or anyone else, both recognized that surviving it together had left them with a deeper, more resilient understanding of each other than they might otherwise have developed. The dreams that had once connected them so vividly during Selene's captivity faded almost entirely once she returned safely home, the strange bond apparently having served its purpose in that critical hour of need and settling now into a quieter, more ordinary rhythm, befitting two mates who no longer needed to reach across dangerous distance to find each other. Occasionally, on nights when one of them faced particularly troubling dreams unrelated to the crisis that had brought them closer, the other would wake with a vague, instinctive awareness that something was wrong, a lingering echo of the powerful connection that had guided Draven through the darkest weeks of his life. But the desperate, vivid conversations of that terrible period never fully returned, and both of them found they did not mourn their absence, grateful instead for the peaceful ordinariness of sleeping soundly beside each other each night. As autumn settled over the packlands, bringing cooler winds and the golden colors of changing leaves to the forests surrounding the castle, Draven found himself reflecting often on how far they had traveled since that terrible morning when he woke to find an empty bed and a single ring left behind. The kingdom itself had emerged from the crisis stronger in many ways than before, its alliances with neighboring packs strengthened by the shared experience of standing together against Cale's aggression, its own internal trust deepened by the honest reckoning that had followed Selene's return. Even the difficult chapters, Perrin's betrayal and its complicated resolution, Isolde's courageous break with her former Alpha, had woven themselves into a larger story of resilience and loyalty that Draven suspected would shape the character of his pack for years to come. Selene, watching him from across their private study, one quiet evening as he worked through the ordinary business of governing that had resumed its familiar rhythm in the months since her return, caught him staring at her with an expression she recognized immediately as the same look he had worn on the night of their bonding ceremony, wonder mixed with a fierce and grateful love that neither time nor danger had managed to diminish. She asked him what he was thinking, and he told her simply that he was grateful, more grateful than words could properly express, that whatever mysterious force had allowed their bond to reach across impossible distance during her captivity had proven strong enough to bring her home to him, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making certain she never again felt she needed to face danger alone. A full season passed before the pack held the celebration that Draven and Selene had quietly agreed would mark, in a way words alone never fully could, the true end of the crisis that had once threatened to tear their kingdom apart. It was not framed as another wedding, since their bond had already been sealed years before, but rather as a renewal, a public reaffirmation before the entire pack that the love and commitment between their king and queen remained unbroken, stronger even, for everything it had survived. The great hall was transformed for the occasion, decorated with autumn colors that mirrored the season outside, tables laden with food, prepared by kitchens that had worked for days to ensure the celebration reflected the joy and relief the entire community felt at having their queen safely restored to them. Wolves from allied packs traveled considerable distances to attend, a testament to the alliances strengthened through the crisis, and even Isolde, now fully settled within her new home, took an active role in helping organize the festivities, her friendship with Selene having grown steadily in the months since her arrival. Draven watched from across the hall as Selene moved among the gathered guests, laughing warmly with old friends and new, her earlier exhaustion and fear replaced entirely by the vibrant warmth that had first drawn him to her many years before. She wore a deep blue gown that evening, chosen deliberately, she had told him with a small smile, because it reminded her of the color of the sky and those strange dreams that had connected them during her captivity, a reminder she wanted to carry forward, not as a memory of fear, but as a symbol of the bond that had proven strong enough to overcome even the most desperate circumstances. When the formal portion of the evening arrived, Draven called for quiet among the assembled crowd and led Selene to stand beside him at the front of the hall, where he addressed his pack one final time about everything they had endured together. He spoke of loyalty, of the courage his mate had shown in trying to protect them all, of the strength of a bond that had guided him through dreams and danger alike, and of his deep gratitude for a pack that had stood firm through uncertainty and welcomed their queen home with open hearts rather than lingering suspicion. He turned to Selene then, taking both her hands in his before the assembled crowd, and spoke words that came not from careful preparation, but directly from the depth of everything he had felt since that terrible morning weeks and months before. He told her that he had once believed nothing could shake the foundation of what they shared, but that her disappearance had taught him something even more important, that their bond was not merely unshakable, but capable of reaching across any distance, surviving any danger, guiding him even through the darkness of uncertain dreams, until it led him back to her side. He promised her, before every witness gathered in that hall, that he would never again allow silence or distance or fear to stand between them, that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, exactly as she had once wished they could have from the very beginning of this ordeal. Selene, her eyes bright with tears she made no effort to hide, answered him with equal honesty, admitting before the assembled pack the mistake she had made in trying to shoulder her fear alone, and promising in turn that she had learned, through weeks of painful separation, the true value of trust freely given, rather than protection offered through secrecy and sacrifice. She told the gathered crowd that she had heard, during her captivity, that love proven only in comfortable times meant little compared to love that endured real testing, and that whatever trials life still held in store for their kingdom, she now understood beyond any doubt that the bond she shared with Draven belonged firmly in the second category, forged and strengthened, rather than broken by the fire it had passed through. The hall erupted into celebration as the two of them embraced, the assembled pack cheering with a joy that felt earned rather than simply performed, a genuine outpouring of relief and happiness from a community that had feared, for weeks, that they might lose their queen entirely to forces beyond their control. Music began, and the formal portion of the evening gave way to dancing and laughter that stretched long into the night. The great hall filled with a warmth that seemed to banish entirely the memory of the fear and uncertainty that had once hung over those same walls. Later that night, once the celebration had wound down and most of the guests had retired to their quarters, Draven and Celine stepped out onto the castle balcony, overlooking the moonlit grounds below, the same grounds where he had once found only a pressed patch of grass and a fading scent to mark where his mate had stood thinking through an impossible choice. Now she stood beside him instead, close and warm and undeniably present, and Draven wrapped his arm around her as they looked out over the peaceful territory stretching before them. He told her, quietly, that he no longer heard her voice calling to him in his dreams, that the strange and desperate connection that had once guided him through the darkest weeks of his life had settled now into something gentler, the ordinary and precious comfort of simply having her beside him each night, rather than needing to search for her across impossible distances while he slept. Celine smiled at that, resting her head against his shoulder, and told him she considered it the best possible outcome, that whatever mysterious power had allowed their bond to reach so far when it needed to, she was glad it no longer needed to work so hard, content instead to simply exist quietly between two people who had proven, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly how far they would go for each other. Below them, the pack lands stretched out peaceful and secure under the bright autumn moon, the forests where danger had once lurked, now simply beautiful in their quiet stillness, the border with Kale's territory holding steady under the careful peace both sides had finally agreed to honor. Draven pulled Celine closer, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, and felt, for the first time since that terrible morning so many months before, a complete and settled peace, the kind that comes only after surviving something that could easily have destroyed everything two people had built together. Their story, whispered afterward among pack members and passed down through generations that followed, was never remembered as a tale of a queen who abandoned her king without explanation, but instead, as the story of a love strong enough to reach across dreams and danger alike, of a king who refused to give up searching, even when every rational sign suggested he should, and of a bond so deeply rooted that even silence, distance, and fear together proved powerless to break it. And on quiet nights, long after the crisis had faded into memory, Draven would sometimes wake in the darkest hour before dawn, reach across the bed, and find Celine there beside him, exactly where she belonged, her final words from that first terrible dream, finally, fully answered, not with forgiveness alone, but with a promise kept, a home rebuilt, and a love that had proven, in the end, entirely unbreakable.